The morning of January 12th, 1888, was deceptively warm. Children left their coats at home, running through melting Nebraska snow. Then, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. In 3 minutes, the temperature plummeted 40 degrees, and a roaring white wall swallowed the plains. The Schoolhouse Blizzard had arrived. In the unforgiving expanse of the Dakota Territory, just north of the Nebraska line, survival was a brutal equation of preparation and luck. Silas Gordon possessed an excess of the former and a deep distrust of the latter. Silas was a man carved from the harsh realities of the frontier. A former surveyor who had seen winter storms freeze men mid-stride, he understood that the prairie was not a place to be conquered, but a beast to be endured. When he purchased his plot in the nascent farming community of O'Neill's Crossing in the summer of 1887, he didn't build a timber frame house like the rest of the optimistic settlers. Wood was brittle, wood sang in the wind and snapped under pressure. Instead, Silas built down. Using a specialized breaking plow, he cut thick, dense ribbons of prairie sod. The earth held together by miles of interlocking blue-stem grass roots. While a standard sod house might take half an acre of earth to build, Silas used 3. He dug the foundation 4 feet into the ground, a subterranean anchor. Above ground, his walls were 3 feet thick, tapered at the top, and reinforced with massive oak timbers he had hauled by wagon over 70 miles from the Missouri River. There were no large, drafty windows to let in the light, only narrow, horizontal slits, heavily shuttered with double-layered wood and iron hinges. The structure squatted on the plains like a massive, earthen bunker. It was dark, claustrophobic, and virtually indestructible. To the residents of O'Neill's Crossing, it was an eyesore. Worse, it was a joke. You building a house, Silas, or digging a mass grave? Ezra Cole, a prominent local wheat farmer, had mocked him outside the general store that autumn. Laughter rippled through the gathered townsfolk. Ezra lived in a beautiful 2-story clapboard house, a symbol of civilization conquering the wild. You'll suffocate in that dirt tomb before the winter even sets in. The wind doesn't respect wood, Ezra, Silas had replied, his voice as dry as the prairie dust. It only respects the earth. When the sky falls, I want dirt over my head. The town dubbed it Gordon's Grave. They whispered that isolation had fractured the man's mind. Then came Thursday, January 12th, 1888. The morning broke with an unnatural, balmy sweetness. For weeks, the plains had been locked in a bitter freeze. But overnight, a warm mass of southern air had pushed northward. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the temperature had climbed into the mid-40s. Icicles wept from the eaves of the town's timber roofs. Farmers unbuttoned their heavy woolen coats. Children, exhausted by months of cabin fever, practically danced to the one-room schoolhouse a mile down the valley, leaving their heavy scarves, mittens, and insulated cloaks hanging on pegs at home. But Silas wasn't shedding layers. He was standing on the reinforced roof of his sod house, staring at the northern horizon. There was a profound, suffocating stillness in the air. The usual relentless prairie breeze had died completely, leaving a vacuum that made Silas's ears pop. His dog, a tough cattle cur, was pacing frantically by the heavy oak door, whining to be let inside. Inside his home, a glass barometer Silas had purchased in Chicago was plummeting faster than he had ever seen, the liquid dropping as if the bottom of the glass had shattered. Silas looked north again. A dark, bruise-colored line was forming on the edge of the world. It didn't look like a cloud bank. It looked like a solid wall of churning ash and pulverized coal. He didn't hesitate. He climbed down from the roof, his boots hitting the muddy earth, and began hauling his winter stockpile of chopped wood inside. He checked his lanterns, his kerosene, and his cured meats. By the time he bolted the heavy iron latches on his door, the sky above had turned a sickly, bruised purple. At 11:30 a.m., the temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than 2 minutes. The silence shattered. A roar, resembling the sound of a dozen freight trains simultaneously derailing, tore across the valley. The wind hit the plains at 60 miles an hour, carrying with it a tidal wave of pulverized, needle-like ice. It wasn't snow. It was frozen dust, so fine that it bypassed the natural filters of the human nose, packing instantly into the lungs of any creature caught breathing it in. Inside his sod fortress, Silas felt the earth tremble, but the 3-foot-thick dirt walls absorbed the kinetic fury of the storm. The wind screamed over his sunken roof, unable to find a vertical edge to tear away. Silas lit a lantern, the yellow glow illuminating his dark, quiet sanctuary. He was safe. But as the wind howled like a tortured animal down the chimney flue, Silas's mind drifted exactly 1 mile south, to the wooden, single-ply walls of the O'Neill's Crossing schoolhouse. Inside the Valley Schoolhouse, 23-year-old Elara Higgins was trying to maintain order. She had 32 students in her care that day, ranging in age from 6-year-old little Sarah Cole up to 18-year-old farmhands who only attended school in the winter months. Because of the beautiful morning, a few locals had also stopped by. Thomas O'Rourke, the town blacksmith, was tinkering with the temperamental cast-iron coal stove in the corner, and 2 travelling peddlers had paused their wagons outside to share a thermos of coffee by the stove. When the storm hit, it didn't announce itself with a gentle flurry. It struck the western wall of the schoolhouse like a physical battering ram. The entire wooden structure groaned violently, shifting an inch off its stone foundation. The windows rattled so hard the glass hummed. Elara dropped her piece of chalk. The bright, sunny room was instantly plunged into twilight as the blinding whiteout eclipsed the sun. "Stay in your seats!" Elara shouted over the sudden, deafening roar. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Thomas O'Rourke, whose face had gone pale beneath his soot-stained skin. "The temperature!" Thomas yelled back, pointing to the window. Frost was literally creeping across the glass in real time, crystalline fractals racing toward the center of the panes. Within 5 minutes, the ambient temperature in the classroom plummeted. The moisture in the children's exhaled breaths began to turn to visible vapor, then to a fine mist of ice that settled on their desks. "Stoke the fire, Thomas. Everything we have," Elara ordered, rushing to the coat room. Her stomach dropped. Half the pegs were empty. The children had come in light sweaters and cotton dresses, fooled by the morning thaw. Outside, the wind accelerated to 70 miles an hour. The snow was a blinding, suffocating mass. To step into it meant losing your orientation in 3 seconds. To breathe it meant drowning in dry land. For the first hour, they survived on the heat of the roaring coal stove. But the flimsy pine boards of the schoolhouse were no match for the barometric pressure and the biting cold. The temperature outside had reached -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind began to physically peel the wooden shingles off the roof, one by one, sounding like a rapid succession of gunshot snaps. Then came the catastrophic crack. The heavy iron chimney pipe, protruding through the roof, shifted as the wind tore at the exterior wood. A gust of cyclonic force caught the lip of the pipe, violently wrenching it sideways. Inside the classroom, the pipe disconnected from the stove with a metallic screech. Black, choking coal smoke billowed into the room, followed instantly by a torrent of sub-zero wind and ice roaring down through the open hole in the ceiling. "The fire!" Thomas yelled, coughing as the smoke blinded them. He grabbed a heavy iron poker, trying to shove the red-hot coals back, but the downdraft of the blizzard was acting like a reverse furnace, blowing the fire out into the room and scattering burning embers across the wooden floorboards. Elara rushed forward with a bucket of drinking water, dousing the embers, but in doing so, she killed their only source of heat. The water that splashed onto the floorboards froze solid in less than 60 seconds. Panic erupted. The younger children began to scream, their tears freezing to their cheeks. The two peddlers huddled in the corner, muttering prayers. "We have to go!" Thomas yelled to Elara over the howling wind. "We have to make a run for town! Town is 2 miles away!" Elara screamed back, wrapping her own shawl around 6-year-old Sarah Cole, who was violently shivering. "They'll freeze before we make it 50 yards. We can't see our own hands in front of our faces. If we stay here, we freeze to death in an hour. The roof is tearing off." Thomas pointed up. The wooden ceiling boards were visibly bowing inward, groaning under the immense weight of the accumulating snowdrifts and the vacuum force of the wind. Elara looked at the terrified faces of her 32 students. They were trapped in a wooden box that was rapidly becoming a freezer. Death was no longer a possibility. It was an approaching certainty, measured in minutes. A mile away, Silas Gordon stood by his heavy oak door. He was warm. He had enough food and fuel to last a month. He owed these people nothing. They had mocked him, isolated him, and called his home a grave. But Silas knew what the wind did to wood. He moved with methodical, practiced speed. He went to his storage room and dragged out a massive industrial spool of thick hemp rope, nearly 2,000 feet of it used for hauling timber. He tied one end of the rope securely to the deepest, thickest support beam in the center of his sod house. He then strapped the spool to a heavy leather harness, slinging it over his broad shoulders. He wrapped himself in 3 layers of wool, topped with a heavy, oil-tanned buffalo hide that draped over his head like a cowl. He strapped snowshoes to his boots and wrapped a woolen scarf over his nose and mouth, leaving only a narrow slit for his eyes. Finally, he grabbed a heavy iron crowbar. When Silas opened his door, the storm tried to rip it from its hinges, but he leaned his massive weight against it, sliding through the gap and pulling it shut behind him. The world outside did not exist. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon. There was only the screaming white wall. It felt as if he had stepped into a raging river of crushed glass. The cold immediately bit through his thick leather gloves, a stinging, venomous pain that sought his bones. Silas didn't try to look. He closed his eyes and relied entirely on the compass in his head and the topography beneath his feet. He knew the slight downward gradient of the prairie that led toward the schoolhouse. He walked backward, leaning his body weight against the wind, letting the heavy rope spool out from his harness. Step by step, he laid a literal lifeline through the void. It took him 45 agonizing minutes to traverse the single mile. His eyelashes froze shut. His lungs burned with the effort of pulling oxygen through the heavy woolen scarf. Twice he was knocked flat by rogue gusts of wind, losing his bearings, only to find the subtle downward slope of the earth beneath the snowdrifts to correct his course. Inside the schoolhouse, the situation had become fatal. The temperature in the room was -10. Children were falling into lethargic stupors, the first dangerous stage of hypothermia. Elara was forcing them to walk in a tight circle, clapping their hands, crying as she slapped their faces to keep them awake. Thomas and the peddlers were desperately pressing their bodies against the western wall, trying to support the bowing wood as the storm hammered it. Suddenly, a heavy, rhythmic thudding sounded over the roar of the wind. Thud, thud, thud. It was coming from the front door. Thomas stepped back, bewildered. He grabbed the iron latch and pulled. The door violently burst open, blown inward by the wind. A massive, snow-covered beast stumbled into the room, covered in thick buffalo hide, frost clinging to every fiber. The figure stood up, slamming the door shut against the tempest and dropping a heavy iron crowbar to the floor. The figure pulled down his frozen scarf, revealing a beard caked in ice. It was Silas Gordon. "Silas," Thomas breathed, unable to believe his eyes. How are you alive?" Silas didn't waste time on pleasantries. He looked around the room, taking in the freezing children, the shattered chimney pipe, the buckling walls. "This building is going to collapse in 20 minutes, Silas barked, his voice gravelly and raw from the cold. He unhooked the heavy harness from his back. The thick hemp rope trailed out from under the crack of the door, disappearing into the white abyss. "I've got a line tied directly to my house," Silas said, looking at Ilara. "We are going to tether every single child to this rope. We are going to walk out into that storm, and we are going to my grave." "Are you insane?" one of the peddlers shrieked, panic breaking his voice. "We can't take children out there. We'll freeze. We'll get lost." "You're already lost," Silas roared over the wind. As if on cue, a massive section of the eastern roof shrieked, tearing upward. A shower of frozen splinters rained down on the desks. "My house is dug into the earth. The wind can't touch it. I have fire. I have food. It's exactly 1 mile away." Ilara Higgins looked at the thick hemp rope in Silas's frozen, gloved hand. She looked at her shivering, dying students. Then she looked at the man the town had mocked as a paranoid fool. "How do we do this?" Ilara asked, her voice steadying. Silas's eyes locked onto hers, burning with fierce, uncompromising resolve. "We tie them together. We don't let go. And no matter what you hear out there in the dark, you do not stop walking." The preparation was a frantic, brutal arithmetic of survival. Silas Gordon and Ilara Higgins tore the schoolhouse's heavy canvas window shades into strips, using them as makeshift harnesses. They worked with ruthless efficiency, lashing the wrists of the younger children directly to the thick, coarse fibers of the hemp rope. Older students were instructed to grip the line with both hands and never let go, their waists tethered with leather belts and torn aprons. "If the person in front of you falls, you pull them up," Silas bellowed, his voice competing with the shrieking timber of the roof above them. "You do not stop. You do not lay down. If you close your eyes and sleep, you will not wake up." Thomas O'Rourke, the blacksmith, took the absolute rear, wrapping the tail end of the heavy line around his massive forearm. He nodded grimly to Silas. They were ready. When Silas kicked the front door open, the storm did not just enter, it swallowed them. The transition from the freezing schoolhouse to the open prairie was like stepping out of a ship's cabin into a violent, churning ocean. The whiteout was absolute. Ilara, positioned directly behind Silas with little Sarah Cole pressed against her legs, could not even see the broad back of the man standing 2 feet in front of her. The wind hit them with the concussive force of a physical blow, instantly knocking several of the younger children to their knees. "Hold the line!" Silas roared into the void. He leaned his immense weight forward, digging his snowshoes into the shifting, pulverized ice, and began to pull. The human chain lurched forward. Every step was an agony of resistance. The wind screamed in their ears, a deafening, continuous jet engine roar that stripped away all other senses. The cold was predatory. It bypassed their meager layers of cotton and wool, sinking teeth of ice into their skin. Within 50 yards, Ilara could no longer feel her feet. Within 100, her eyelashes had frozen shut, requiring her to physically peel them apart with her stiff, numbed fingers. They moved at a miserable, agonizing crawl. Silas was a blind titan at the front, his heavy buffalo hide snapping violently in the gale. He kept one hand firmly clamped on the taut rope leading back to his sod house, using it as his singular compass, while his other hand hauled the terrified, freezing weight of 36 souls behind him. Then, exactly halfway across the valley, the rope went rigid. Silas stopped, nearly pulled backward, He yanked on the line, but it wouldn't give. He turned back, his heart seizing in his chest. Had the line snagged? Had someone fallen and anchored the chain? He shoved past Elara, moving hand over hand down the rope into the blinding white. 10 yards back, the line was severely deflected, pulled sharply to the east. Following it, Silas tripped over something massive and solid, hidden beneath a fresh snowdrift. It wasn't a fallen child, it was a wooden wheel. Wiping the ice from his eyes, Silas squinted through the blinding fury. Huddled in the lee of 3 overturned cargo wagons were masses of dark shapes. Horses lay frozen in their traces, a grim testament to the speed of the temperature drop. Pressed against the undercarriages of the splintered wagons were people, dozens of them. It was a convoy from O'Neill's Crossing. Silas dropped to his knees, grabbing the shoulder of the nearest man, who was curled into a tight ball. The man looked up, his face a horrifying mask of blue skin and white frost. It was Ezra Cole. "Ezra!" Silas shouted, shaking him. Ezra's eyes were vacant, the lethargy of deep hypothermia setting in. "Silas," he mumbled, barely audible over the roaring wind. "The general store. The roof caved in. We tried to reach the church. Turned around. Lost." Silas quickly counted the huddled masses. Men, women, elderly townsfolk, and merchants. There were 34 people slowly dying behind the shattered wagons. They had been blindly walking in circles for an hour before stumbling into Silas's heavy hemp lifeline, clinging to it without knowing where it led. "Get up!" Silas roared, striking Ezra across the face with his thick leather glove to shock him out of the stupor. "You are dying here, Ezra! Get your people up!" "Can't!" Ezra wept, his tears freezing instantly. "Can't walk. Too cold." "You have no choice." Silas grabbed Ezra by the lapels of his frozen coat and hauled him violently to his feet. "My house is at the end of this line. The school children are on it. We move now, or we are buried here." The realization that his daughter, Sarah, was out in the storm seemed to inject a final, desperate jolt of adrenaline into Ezra's freezing blood. He turned to the huddled townsfolk, his voice cracking as he screamed for them to rise. Silas didn't wait. He began hauling the freezing adults toward the main line. It was a chaotic, terrifying process in the blinding whiteout. Fingers were too numb to tie knots, so Silas and Thomas O'Rourke used the townsfolk's own frozen belts and suspenders to clip them onto the hemp rope, wedging them between the older students. The weight on the lifeline was now catastrophic. 70 people were anchored to a single strand of hemp, battered by 80-mile-an-hour cyclonic winds. "We pull together," Silas screamed, moving back to the front of the line. "Nobody stops." The final half-mile was a descent into a frozen hell. The barometric pressure continued to plummet, bringing with it a darkness so profound it felt like the sun had been permanently extinguished. The wind shifted, turning into a cross gale that blasted them from the side. It was no longer just blowing snow, it was hurling chunks of hardened ice and debris across the plains. At the front, Silas was operating on sheer animal endurance. The drag of 70 bodies behind him, combined with the hurricane-force winds, pushing against his chest, made every step require the effort of a heavy deadlift. The thick hemp rope bit deeply into his shoulder, through the heavy leather harness, threatening to dislocate his joint. Behind him, Elara was physically dragging little Sarah Cole. The 6-year-old's legs had given out entirely. Elara looped her arms under the girl's armpits, screaming prayers into the howling wind, her own strength failing rapidly. Behind her, Ezra Cole stumbled blindly, clutching the rope with hands that were completely black with frostbite. Just 10 more steps, Silas told himself, his mind narrowing to a pinpoint of survival. 10 more steps. Then the rope gave way. It didn't snap, but it went frighteningly slack. Silas pitched forward into a snowdrift. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his chest. He scrambled to his feet, pulling the line frantically. Had it untied from the center beam of his house? Had the wind finally won? He hauled the slack in, foot by foot, terror rising in his throat. Suddenly, his gloved hand struck something hard, flat, and immovable. Wood, iron. He hadn't lost the line. He had reached the door. "We're here!" Silas bellowed, though he couldn't even hear his own voice over the storm. He fumbled with the heavy iron latch, his numb fingers slipping uselessly against the frozen metal. Desperation fueled him. He grabbed the iron crowbar still strapped to his side and smashed it against the frozen latch. The ice shattered, and Silas threw his massive shoulder against the oak planks. The door swung inward. The interior of the sod house was pitch black, save for the dying embers in the stone hearth. But to the freezing survivors, the air rolling out of the doorway felt like a blast from a tropical furnace. Silas braced his back against the doorframe, anchoring the line. "Inside! Go inside!" he roared, grabbing the first shape that emerged from the whiteout, Elara Higgins, and shoving her into the darkness of his home. One by one, they stumbled out of the screaming abyss. Thomas O'Rourke practically carried 2 younger children over the threshold. Ezra Cole fell onto the packed earth floor, weeping uncontrollably as he found his daughter, Sarah, alive and breathing in Elara's arms. The peddlers, the farmers, the school children. They piled into the subterranean bunker, collapsing in heaps of frost-covered wool and shivering limbs. It took another 15 minutes to drag the last stragglers inside. By the time Thomas, the final man on the line, cleared the doorway, Silas's muscles were locked in agonizing cramps. He threw his weight against the heavy oak door, pushing against the furious wind that sought to enter with them. With a final, guttural shout, he slammed the door shut and threw the heavy iron deadbolt. The silence that followed was jarring. The horrific, deafening roar of the blizzard was instantly muted to a dull, distant vibration. The 3-foot-thick walls of interlocking earth and roots absorbed the sound and the cold completely. Silas struck a match with trembling hands and lit a kerosene lantern. The yellow glow washed over the room. It was a staggering sight. 70 people were packed shoulder to shoulder in the claustrophobic, dirt-walled fortress. Children were huddled in corners. Men were slumped against the earthen walls, gasping for air. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, fear, and thawing earth. Silas moved slowly, his body aching. He grabbed an armful of cured oak from his stockpile and stoked the massive stone hearth. Within minutes, a roaring fire cast dancing shadows across the sod ceiling. He pulled down blankets, buffalo robes and furs, tossing them into the crowd. Ezra Cole, still shivering violently, slowly pushed himself up from the floor. He looked at the thick dirt walls, at the low ceiling reinforced with massive oak beams. He listened to the muffled, impotent fury of the storm raging outside, a storm that was currently ripping their beautiful wooden town to splinters. Ezra looked at Silas, who was quietly melting snow in a large cast-iron pot over the fire to provide drinking water. "You were right," Ezra whispered, his voice hoarse, tears cutting clean lines through the soot and frost on his face. He looked around the packed earthen room that he had once mocked. "We called this a grave, Silas. God forgive us." Silas didn't look up from the fire. He merely stirred the melting snow, the orange light reflecting in his exhausted eyes. "A grave is where you put the dead, Ezra," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "This is just the earth, and the earth protects her own." For 12 more hours, the Schoolhouse Blizzard battered the Dakota Territory. Above ground, the world was subjected to a freezing, abrasive death. But beneath the howling winds, entombed within the quiet, stubborn dirt of the prairie, 70 people sat in the warmth of the fire, listening to the storm rage, safely held in the hands of the fool they had mocked. When the sun finally pierced the clouds 2 days later, O'Neill's Crossing was a splintered ruin. Dozens had perished in the surrounding counties, frozen mere yards from their own front doors. Yet, emerging from the dark, earthen floor of Silas Gordon's mocked and ridiculed bunker were 70 living, breathing souls. The prairie had shown its ruthless fury, but the fool's grave had proven to be their only sanctuary.